Hey students, in this video we're going to cover the second part of the study guide, which is justifying congruence and what other information we need to know to prove the triangles are congruent. So for one, we have side, angle, side. And what we're going to do is use any assumed information and other stuff that we would need to know. So let's do the assumed stuff in red and the stuff that we would need to know in blue, for instance. So what's assumed is that vertical angles are congruent. So we'll put assumed, you know what, we'll just use A for assumed. So we're not writing a whole word each time. So what's going to be assumed is that angle XYZ is congruent to angle, so XYZ is going to be congruent to angle PYR. That's what is assumed. And what we need to know, we'll put a K. And so what else we would need to know is, so for side angle side, we're going to need to know that ZY is congruent to RY. So we would need to know segment ZY is congruent to segment RY. I can do better. There we go. So segment RY. Cool. For number two, we have angle, side. So again, what we can assume is that, again, vertical angles are congruent. So the assumed information is angle STU is congruent to angle CTA. And now what we would need to know is one other piece of information. So what we need to know to get angle, side is either, we would need to know angle U is congruent to angle A. That's the only other possibility. So we would, let's label these with two arcs. So we would need to know angle TUS is congruent to angle ATC. So we said STU and CTA. And so then angle TUS is going to be congruent to angle TAC. I'm sorry, angle TAC. Let's go in that order. All right. And so the reason we can't use C and S is that it would give us angle, side, angle. So for number three, all right, so it's a right triangle. So we already have the hypotenuses are congruent. So we already have that. So in this case, there's nothing that we can assume. All we need to know is that one pair of these legs are congruent. So we would either need to know YW is congruent to, let's see, VT, for instance. Or we could also know, separate from that, is we could also know that WX is congruent to TU. So one of these has to be true, not both, just one of the two. For number four, we have angle, side, angle. So we already have two congruences labeled, so we just need to know one other thing. So for angle, side, angle, the side needs to help make both of the angles. So that means that angle G is going to need to be congruent to angle J. So we would need to also know angle G is congruent to angle J. And that gives us our three pairs of congruences. For number five, for side, what we can assume is the reflexive property. So the assumption is that HJ is congruent to itself because it's in both triangles. So HJ is congruent to HJ. And then for the other side congruence, we would need to know JX is congruent to JI. For number 6, it's another side. So we can assume, again, reflexive property, we can assume that XZ, so XZ is congruent to itself. And so then what we would need to know is that XJ and ZY are congruent. So XJ is congruent to ZY. For number 7, it's another hypotenuse leg. So in this case, there are going to be two things that we need to know because we don't have anything marked, and we have an assumption we can use. The first thing that we can assume is HI is congruent to itself. So HI is congruent to HI, and that's because of the reflexive property. And what we would now need to know is that the hypotenuses, which are across from the right angles, are congruent. So we would need to know that JI is congruent to SI. For number 8, we have side angle side. So the side that we know to be congruent to itself is YX. So that's the assumed information. We know that YX is congruent to YX. Cool. And now what we would need to know for side angle side is segment JX is congruent to segment WX. So we would need to know JX is congruent to WX. And that's going to give us side angle side because we would have a side, an angle, and another side. Number 9 is angle side angle. And that is going to be, again, using the assumed information first, we're going to have this side UT is congruent to itself. So assumed is UT is congruent to UT. And what we need to know is that, so now we have an angle aside. So then that forces us to use angle AUT. So angle AUT is going to be congruent to angle SUT. All right, and so that is going to get us the congruences that we need for angle side angle. So again, we would have an angle, a side, and an angle. And so the last one is number 10, angle side. What can be assumed is that ED is congruent to itself. So ED is congruent to ED. That is our assumed information. And now for angle side, what we would need to know is, we have a choice here. So the first thing that we would need to know is that angle FDE is congruent to angle KDE. So we would need to know this angle is congruent to that angle, or we could also know that angle FED, we could also know that angle FED is congruent to angle KED. One of those things has to be true. The assumption we always have to use the assumption and then fill in what we need to know. Either one of these angles, the blue or yellow, would give us angle side. All right, so that concludes our video for justifying congruence. So remember, when we are justifying congruence, we have information that we can assume,
and information that we need to know. Sometimes we don't have any information that we need to assume, like in the case of number 4. And anytime we have a sheared side, that can always be assumed to be congruent, as can vertical angles be assumed to be congruent. All right.